So, the fourth and final week of There's No Place Like Home. The first week we talked about when the spinning stops and talking about chaos and confusion. The next week, the flying monkeys, and that the best defense is a good offense. And last week we looked at the Tin Man, searching for a heart only to understand it was there all along. He just hadn't mined it for its full use and worth. Today, behind the curtain, who's to blame? Blame is one of those interesting characteristics and terms that we have. We're going to dig into that today. And I had a lighthearted moment of blame yesterday. I blamed autofill for something that happened. I had sent out a calendar invitation to one of the leadership teams. And when it says location, I just typed in community room and went right on and clicked send. Late yesterday, I got an email from Drexel. And it was a screenshot. And when I put in community room, it added and wine. And then it added a little town in Sicily was the location. So Drexel was very excited. I didn't get to tell that story at 9 o'clock, but I'll let him know that he was mentioned. So I blamed autofill, and that happens on occasion. But we're quick to blame people sometimes. I've referenced Brene Brown on many occasions and talked about stories that she's shared and insights that she's had that she shared with her audience. She tells a story of getting up one Sunday morning, and she had her first cup of coffee, and she's on to her second cup of coffee, and she picks it up off the counter, and it slips out of her hand and crashes right to the ground, coffee all over her clothes and the cup in millions of pieces. And her immediate reaction when it hit the ground was, "Dang it, Steve," her husband. And she said, the reason I was blaming him right away is because on Saturday night, he had gone to a sporting event, and he knows that I can't go to sleep without him there, and everything kind of settled in. And he got home later than usual, and it was way past my bedtime. And normally I only have one cup of coffee. But because he was so late, I had to go to a second cup of coffee. So the reason I had a second cup of coffee was all his fault. Therefore, it was all his fault. We're quick to blame. She talks about blame being the discharging of discomfort and pain. And I think that's a good description. It corrodes relationships. But she also said something interesting that blame, there's a inverse relationship between blame and accountability. The more we blame, the less accountable we're willing to be. The more accountable we're willing to be, the less blaming we're going to be of others. Let's look at the definition. A transitive verb with an object. Now that's an important thing. Blame always has an object. Assigned responsibility for a fault or a wrong. Well, blame is one of those things that's typically negative. We see it in relationships. We see it sometimes when couples get divorced. Some of us in this room have been through divorces. And what I've observed through the years when observing couples that are struggling and go through that is that the person who makes the initial step, the decision and or initiates the divorce, typically gets the blame from friends and family and others. But we know that one person isn't solely responsible. But that's kind of how blame works. It's discharging of the discomfort and pain toward others. Often it's negative. But responsibility can be positive. An entirely different type of thing. I'm going to share some comments from one of Laney's favorite opinion makers, Tom Brady, the quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week he was interviewed, and this is what he said. He said, "Life is about always changing and adapting to different things. Today, the world wants to blame and shame and guilt and fear everything all the time. We would never teach our kids that, we would never say, this is how you're going to get through life the best. You're going to blame everyone when things don't go right. Or you'll say, I always get it my way, but you should never get it your way. That's not how to live a joyful life." How true. We want to have a joyful life, but Responsibility is a positive. Blame is negative. President Teddy Roosevelt said this way: if you could kick the person in the pants responsible for most of your trouble, you wouldn't sit for a month. How true that can be. Well, blame is tough because it's an emotional word. Even as children on the playground, he did this and she did that, and it wasn't me. And we're all emotional about that. And it ratchets up emotions all the way into adulthood, to where either it's in talking about a spouse, he or she did this, and we're all emotional maybe at work because the boss wanted this, and my coworker did it wrong, and I'm trying to pick up the pieces, and we spend so much energy and emotion blaming, and we ratchet that up. So blame is an emotional word, but responsibility is a descriptive word. It's really looking at the anatomy of an issue or a problem. It focuses our energy there. Let's pick up the story of Dorothy and her friends. They're now face to face with the huge image of the Wizard of Oz and the deep, booming voice of the Wizard of Oz.
Please, sir, we've done what you told us. We brought you the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. We melted her.
Oh, you liquidated her, eh? Very resourceful.
Yes, sir. So we'd like you to keep your promise to us, if you please, sir.
Not so fast. Not so fast. I'll have to give the matter a little thought. Go away and come back tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Oh, but I want to go home now.
You've had plenty of time already.
Yeah. Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz. I said come back tomorrow.
If you were really great and powerful, you'd keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the great Oz? You ungrateful creatures think yourselves lucky that I'm giving you audience tomorrow instead of 20 years from now.
Oh,
The great Oz has spoken.
oh,
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And yet, Dorothy, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, the Lion, they have been on this journey, and they thought someone else was pulling the strings and manipulating all these encounters, when in fact it was their own fears, their own anxieties, and their own pursuit of certain things. So what happens when the curtain is pulled back and there's really nothing there but an illusion? Who's to blame for all of the things that we've been blaming others for? Well, Jesus was familiar with the blame game. The disciples and Jesus encountered a man one day in their ministry, encountered a man that had been born blind. Let's look at what the disciples said. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? They wanted to place blame somewhere. And in that culture, and even today, somebody that's born with a handicap, there was an assumption that there was some sin somewhere that caused God to smite this unborn child with this disease or this malady. That's not the God I know. It wasn't the God Jesus knew. Jesus said, neither this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. Now we're going to camp out here for just a moment, and I need you to pay careful attention because it's a little minute and tedious. You may be aware that in the written Greek language, there is no punctuation. I've read the Greek New Testament way back in the day when I was studying Greek, and there's no punctuation. So you infer the punctuation from the tenses of the verbs and the nouns and all those things going together. And early on in the translation of the Greek New Testament, when the translation started happening, they translated it just like you and I saw. It wasn't this man sinned or his parents, but that the work of God might be shown in him. In other words, God caused this for that. Well, let's punctuate it differently. It wasn't that this man sinned or his parents, period. but that the works of God should be revealed in him, comma, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. Whatever way you want to punctuate it, Jesus was basically saying, it's not a blame question. It's not about who to blame. And we spend time picking out who to blame when God's saying, we've got stuff to do here. We have work to do, and we're going to come a time when we don't have any more time. You know, all the generations talk about, is this the end times? Well, I had a college professor that said it really well. He said, you know, it may not be the end times for the world, but it's the end times for you and me. We've only got so much time. So Jesus says it's not the question of blame, but we want to blame someone. We want to blame someone. We want to point the finger. You know, sometimes there's just no one to blame, and that's what Jesus is saying. We need to work to find the way that God is calling us to minister and to be impactful in other people's lives. But we're like the disciples. We want to point the finger. And the truth is, we often choose blame over living with unanswerable questions. We've all experienced heartache and some of us tragedies. In ministry, we're often asked questions from someone bereaved, someone having experienced a tragedy, loss of a child, a tragic loss of a spouse, cancer and disease. And I can't count the number of times that someone has come up to me and said, Terry, why did this happen? But you know, they're not asking who to blame. And they're not even wanting a theological explanation of how God works in our universe and how we're in a broken and fragmented world and stuff happens. All they're saying is, I'm hurting. It feels horrible. And my response is never to explain the why. I don't know all the whys. My response to why did this happen is, I know how hard this hurts and how difficult this is for you. And we and others will be with you walking through this. That's what that person needs to hear in that moment. But still, we're all inclined to place a blame rather than living with that kind of unanswerable question. We want to blame others. We don't want the finger pointed at us. We want to point the finger elsewhere. We don't want to be considered a part of the group that everybody's blaming for this or that. We want to hide in the shadows. You may remember Peter, after the crucifixion, the disciples scattered, and Peter was left kind of lingering and meandering throughout the town square and sitting and just in mourning and devastation and shock. He was confronted 3 times. Let's look at these. A person said, you also were with Jesus of Galilee, but he denied it before them all. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. Then the next person. Another servant girl saw him and said, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. And then the third, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. I don't know the man. Well, we want to blame others. We want to point the finger elsewhere. We want to hide in the shadows when the fingers are pointed to us. We want to blame others for pulling strings in life. Well, the government's doing this, and my boss is doing this, and my employer is doing this. And granted, there are many things happening in my life that I had nothing to do with initiating. Maybe it's responding to having to pay taxes. Maybe it's responding to an employer's request or some kind of direction. It can be any kinds of, there are all kinds of people pulling strings. But the problem is, nobody's pulling the strings about how I respond to those. Nobody's pulling strings and making me react a certain way. We want to blame others for pulling strings, but it's because we want to blame others for our actions. I did this because he did this first, or I would have never said that if she hadn't done this. We want to explain our own actions by putting blame on other people. We want to blame others for our bad circumstances, our unhappiness, maybe our bad financial situation, bad relationships. Ultimately, there's enough blame to go around, but where's the responsibility? Where's the accountability? Some of you know James Corden, the talk show host, but also he does the carpool karaoke, and just seeing the sheer joy in his life and the excitement. He's there with his idols, and he's singing with them in the car and interacting. And he was in a radio interview and talking about every day his mission is to grab as much joy out of life as possible. Where can I find joy? How can I help this experience with this person be joyful? How can I help my staff and my team have joy? How can I help my kids and my wife experience joy on a daily basis? He tells the story of his father coming to him and saying, James, you should never rate your opinion of yourself by the metric of the joyless. Do you know joyless people? They kind of suck the life out of you and rob you of the joy. It really comes down to one question. Who's responsible for your joyful living? Who in your life has the power to claim a joyful life? You know, Glenda tells Dorothy at the end, Dorothy, you always had the power to go home to Kansas. You and I always have the power for joyful living. We always had the power to have that kind of experience day to day. Facing day-to-day struggles and dealing with difficulties and disappointments, we want to believe somehow that somewhere over that rainbow there's a land where skies are blue and dreams do come true. That someday we might wake up where the clouds are far behind us and where troubles even melt like lemon drops. That someday that's where you'll find me, way above the chimney tops. Even birds fly over the rainbow. Why can't I? Jesus says, stop blaming. Trust me. Stop dreaming away today's moments for that rainbow and experience joyful living now. Maybe we can't fly over the rainbow, but God tells us that we can soar on wings like eagles. We can run and not be weary. We can walk and never faint. Amen.